Hi, my name is Steve Johnson, and I'm a docent at the San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park. I'm here to talk about ship caulking, what it is, why it is important to San Francisco maritime history, and how to do it. I'll include a demonstration of deck caulking. Ship caulking is sealing the seams of hulls and decks on wooden ships. It's done to keep the water from penetrating into the interior of the ship. The caulking trade dates back at least 400 years. The San Francisco Bay had hundreds of wooden ships around the turn of the century. It was important to have ship caulkers trained to maintain the integrity of the hulls of those ships. This slide shows what San Francisco looked like in 1915, the year of the San Francisco Exposition. You can see the ferry building and the Hyde Street Pier in the drawing. Notice the large number of wooden ships in the bay and the fact that there are no bridges across the bay. The Golden Gate and San Francisco Bay bridges weren't completed until 1937. The main method of crossing the bay at this time was by ferry boat. There were about 26 ferry routes across the bay at this time. Most of these ferries were made of wood. The ferries carried people and automobiles, and separate ferries carried railroad cars. This is what the Hyde Street Pier looked like in 1931. The pier was one of several ferry terminals in San Francisco. The primary terminal was at the ferry building. The Hyde Street Pier had 5 ferry routes, primarily going to Sausalito and to Berkeley. My grandfather was a ship caulker. His name was Fred Burnett. He was born in 1893 and orphaned 2 years later. He was at an orphanage in Marin County until 1906. He ran away from that orphanage a few months after the Great Earthquake. He and his brother Norman worked several jobs until becoming apprentice ship caulkers, working for the Southern Pacific Railroad, caulking railroad ferry boats. Over his career, Fred worked around the Bay Area, up and down the west coast of the United States. He also spent a year at Pearl Harbor prior to the Japanese attack. Fred was an apprentice caulker in 1912 when he met his future wife, Mary. It was love at first sight, he said. They kept company, as dating was called in those days, for 3 years until he completed his apprenticeship and they could afford to get married. They were married on December 31st, 1915, and were married for 57 years until Mary's death in 1973. This photo of them was taken in 1914, a year before they were married. You can see how happy they were at this time in their lives. This slide shows Fred and Norman at work caulking a ship's hull. You can see the ship is in dry dock and they are working on a scaffold. You can also see the caulking mallets and oakum rope hanging down as they work. How do you caulk a ship? First, you remove the old caulking with a reef or reaming iron. Then you roll the oakum, which is hemp rope soaked in pine tar, into a small rope about 12 inches long. Tap the rope into the seam using a thread or thin iron. After a couple of threads, you make the joint tight using a making or thick iron. If you're sealing a deck, you pitch the deck as a final step using heated pine pitch. Modern pitch is actually called marine glue. It's like roofing tar with a plasticizer. You might use a hot rod, like a tire iron, heated in the fire to even out the pitch and remove any bubbles. Finally, you scrape away the excess pitch with a putty knife. These photos show a variety of the tools of the trade used in caulking. The flat irons are used for caulking. The slanted and curved irons are used to remove old caulking and are generally called reaming or reef irons. The caulking mallet is about 12 inches long with a 12-inch handle. The rings on the mallet are tempered steel. There's also a photo on the right of a pitch runner. Hot pitch is ladled into the runner, which is then dragged along the seam. This pitch runner is shown on a mock-up of a deck. This drawing shows how the oakum is twisted and driven into the hull or a deck seam using the thread and making irons. Now watch this demo video of the caulking process.
And you use this stuff called oakum, hemp rope soaked in pine tar, and it's the same pine tar that baseball players put on their bats. So you take this hemp rope, you twist it into a thread, and then you take a thread iron, which is a thin iron, and you take that and a caulking mallet, and then you pound it into the seam. This is the world's smallest caulking deck demo, but you get the idea. So you do that, and then you, after a couple of layers of that, you come back with a thing called a making iron. So this is a thread iron to get the thread in. This is a making iron to make the joint tight. So you take that, put that in, a couple of blows, and you want to give it a try? If I had an audience here, the kids would be dying to try it out, and they love doing this stuff. So that's really an important part of my demo, is getting the kids involved with doing it. And if it is a deck, like this is a simulated deck, you finish it off by doing something called pitching the deck. And I have a picture of a pitch runner later in my program. But you heat this stuff up, and it's like roofing tar, and I actually use something similar to roofing tar today. Put it in the pitch runner, put it down the seam. You have a hot rod, which is like a tire iron, that you heat up in the fire, run that down the seam to get all the bubbles out, and then you take a putty knife and you finish it off, and that will last 20 or 25 years versus the modern materials last maybe 5 years. So
Here is a photo of Fred doing a caulking demonstration at the Oakland Museum in the 1970s. His motto was, "I only do good work." Not all shipyards and caulkers did the best job possible. In some cases, that resulted in the ship needing to be recaulked sooner. Fred was not one of those okay caulkers. He only did good work. Here is a summary of what we talked about today. Ship caulking is sealing the seams on wooden ships using oakum and pine tar. Caulking was historically important to the San Francisco Bay because of the large number of wooden ships and lack of bridges crossing the bay in the early 20th century. My grandfather, Fred Burnett, and his fellow caulkers made an important contribution to the shipbuilding in the early 20th century. It's important to do ship caulking or any other maritime trade craft to the highest quality standards. Only do good work. Thank you for watching this presentation.